The server room smelled like fried plastic and expensive cologne. Julian stood there, holding a ring light like a scepter, while the mainframe hummed a low, dying note. He smirked, adjusting his pastel blazer for the camera. Fired me to look smart, the CEO's husband said. I handed over my badge with a steady hand. You have 15 minutes before the system fails. Tell your wife good luck. The sudden panic in his eyes was priceless. He didn't even know what a DNS record was. Julian's thumb hovered over his phone, his influencer confidence curdling into a pale, sweaty mask. He glanced at the blinking amber lights on the rack, realizing too late they weren't decorative. I watched him try to find a physical reset button on a virtualized environment. The air conditioning kicked into high gear, screaming against the rising heat of unmonitored processors. My proprietary scripts were already beginning to expire. He reached for my shoulder, but I stepped back into the shadows. The exit door felt heavy. I walked through the open plan office, passing rows of dynamic hires who were busy filming TikTok resumes. They didn't look up from their screens as the overhead lights flickered once, then twice. The ceiling fans slowed to a rhythmic, ominous crawl. These people were the future Sarah wanted, yet they couldn't see the digital foundation rotting beneath their ergonomic chairs. My boots clicked against the polished concrete, a metronome for the collapse. Somewhere behind me, a cooling fan gave up and died with a metallic shriek. Across the street, the cafe was quiet and smelled of burnt espresso. I sat by the window, watching the 15th floor of the glass cube. My tablet stayed face down on the scratched wooden table. Every few seconds, the device vibrated against the grain, a silent plea from the dying network. Julian was likely screaming at an intern by now, demanding a password I had never written down. I ordered a black coffee and waited. The first dashboard on my screen turned a violent, irreversible red. The CEO's black SUV pulled into the fire lane with reckless haste. Sarah stepped out, her phone pressed to her ear as she looked up at the building. She looked smaller from this distance, stripped of her boardroom armor. A group of developers huddled on the sidewalk, their faces illuminated by the frantic blue glow of their handheld devices. They were locked out of the VPN, ghosts in their own machine. I took a slow sip of the bitter brew. My phone screen finally went dark. A single notification popped up on my private encrypted line. It wasn't a plea for help or a professional apology. It was a Venmo transfer for $5 from Julian, titled with a single word, please. I didn't click accept. Instead, I watched the office lights on the 15th floor begin to shut off, one department at a time. The automated security protocols were finally kicking in, sealing the doors against everyone, including the owners. I realized then that I didn't want the money. I just wanted the silence. The black coffee turned cold as the tablet vibrated against the table. I watched Sarah pace the sidewalk through the cafe window. Her silhouette was a jagged line against the glass. Julian emerged from the lobby, his pastel blazer now wrinkled and damp. He looked like a man who had tried to fight a ghost and lost. My phone chimed with a high priority alert. The main supply chain node had just suffered a catastrophic failure. The hemorrhage was finally official. I leaned back and watched the chaos unfold across the street. A delivery truck pulled up, then stopped as the automated gates refused to recognize its digital signature. The driver climbed out, waving a frustrated hand at the empty security booth. Julian was shouting into his phone now, his gestures wild and desperate. He looked toward the cafe, his eyes scanning the crowd. He knew I was nearby. I didn't hide. I simply took another slow sip of the bitter liquid. My laptop screen flickered with a new series of incoming pings. These weren't from the office. They were from the vendor I had warned Julian about weeks ago. They were demanding an immediate audit of the transaction logs. If the logs were missing, the legal liability would fall entirely on Sarah. I realized then that Julian had deleted more than just my access. He had wiped the compliance history. The legal vultures were already circling the building. The pressure was becoming physical. A shadow fell over my table as the cafe door chimed. I didn't look up to see who it was. The scent of synthetic vanilla and expensive perfume arrived first. Sarah pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down. She didn't offer a greeting or a smile. Her face was a mask of cold corporate efficiency. "We need the secondary authentication keys," she said. Her voice was brittle. I looked at her and saw the cracks in her empire. She was terrified. I placed my hands flat on the table. "You fired the only person who holds those keys," I said quietly. She flinched as if I had struck her. "Julian told me the migration was complete," she whispered. Her eyes darted toward my tablet screen. I closed the lid with a definitive click. "Your husband lied to look smart, Sarah. Now you are paying for his vanity." She reached for her bag, likely looking for a checkbook. She still thought this was about money. It was about respect. The light in the cafe shifted as the sun dipped behind the glass tower. Sarah leaned forward, her composure finally breaking. "Please, Mike. The board is meeting in an hour. If the system isn't back, they'll vote me out." I watched a single tear track through her heavy foundation. It was a calculated move. But I wasn't the same man who had saved her last year. "You have 40 minutes left," I said. I stood up and pulled my jacket on. I wasn't staying. I walked toward the door without looking back. Sarah called my name, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of traffic. I stepped onto the sidewalk and felt the cool evening air. My phone buzzed one last time. It wasn't a message from Sarah or Julian. It was an anonymous tip from an internal server. Someone had just tried to bypass the hardware lock. They had triggered the final self-destruct protocol. The entire database was now erasing itself. There was no going back. The database wipe hissed through my distant tablet. Julian ran toward me, his face pale and wet. "Help us," he gasped. I stepped into traffic. Sarah stood frozen as sirens wailed nearby. The cloud logs showed Julian's personal login. He had started the purge to hide debt. The sirens wailed closer as I crossed the street, leaving Julian collapsed on the hot pavement. He had tried to play God with a system he barely understood. Now the logs on my tablet confirmed his desperate attempt to scrub the financial records. He was deleting evidence of his own gambling debts. The data was vanishing in real time. I felt a strange sense of relief. The burden of their lies was no longer my secret to keep. Sarah watched from the curb, her expensive phone clutched like a weapon. She saw me checking the tablet and lunged forward. "Give me that device, Mike," she demanded. Her voice was a jagged edge of authority. I didn't stop walking. I slipped the tablet into my bag and locked the zipper. She couldn't touch me here. The street was neutral ground, but the fire she had started was spreading fast. She looked ready to scream for help. A black sedan screeched to a halt near the fire hydrant. Two men in charcoal suits stepped out, ignored the screaming Julian, and walked straight to Sarah. They weren't tech support. They were the forensic auditors from the venture capital group. Sarah's face drained of all remaining color. She looked at the building, then back at the men. The timing was perfect. My warnings had reached the board just as the systems began their final, terminal descent. The lead auditor looked at me and nodded once. He knew exactly who held the remaining keys to the kingdom. Sarah tried to block his path, but she was invisible to him. "Is there any integrity left in the secondary nodes?" the auditor asked. I checked my phone one last time. The hardware lock had held against Julian's clumsy purge. Some data survived. I looked at Sarah and saw a predator finally realizing she was the prey. "The backup scripts are mine, not the company's," I said firmly. The auditors exchanged a sharp look. This changed the entire legal landscape. Sarah's hands started to shake as she realized the depth of the hole Julian had dug for them. She had signed the intellectual property rider without reading it. Everything I built was legally shielded from their reach. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was the owner of the only evidence that could save her. Julian groaned from the sidewalk, trying to stand up. He looked at the auditors and then at his wife. "I fixed it, Sarah," he lied, his voice cracking. The auditor laughed, a short and brutal sound. "You didn't fix anything, Julian. You just triggered a federal investigation." The panic in the air was thick enough to taste. Julian's eyes met mine, pleading for a miracle I wouldn't provide. I turned my back on both of them. The auditors walked toward the lobby, beckoning me to follow. Sarah stood alone in the shadow of the glass tower. She looked up at the darkened 15th floor. The lights were out, and the power was shifted. I felt my phone vibrate with a new encrypted message. It was a subpoena delivered to my digital inbox. The board wasn't asking for my help anymore. They were demanding my testimony against the CEO. The real war had just begun. I walked toward the lobby with the auditors while Sarah remained rooted to the concrete. The glass doors slid open with a hiss, admitting a rush of chilled, sterile air. Inside, The usual hum of productivity had vanished. It was replaced by the frantic clicking of keyboards and low, panicked whispers. The outsourced tech team was huddled around the main console like surgeons over a corpse. They didn't have the decryption keys. They only had questions I wouldn't answer. The lead auditor, a man named Miller, led me toward the private elevators. "We need to secure the physical servers before Julian tries another remote bypass," he said. I touched the tablet in my bag, feeling the heat of the battery through the fabric. The system was still trying to purge itself in the background. My scripts were fighting Julian's clumsy deletion commands. It was a digital war of attrition. We stepped into the elevator, and the doors shut. We reached the 15th floor and found the server room in total disarray. Julian had left the master console open, but the screen was filled with scrolling error codes. Red light bathed the racks, making the room look like a slaughterhouse. Miller gestured for me to sit at the terminal. I hesitated. Once I logged in, my presence would be officially recorded in the forensic trail. I would be tethered to this disaster forever. I chose to proceed. I bypassed Julian's lock in 4 keystrokes. The audit trail was a mess of illegal overrides and failed authentication attempts. Every single one was time-stamped to Julian's personal laptop. I realized then that he wasn't just hiding gambling debt. He had been skimming from the vendor payments for nearly a year. Sarah had to have known. No one misses that much missing capital without looking the other way. The power balance shifted again. This wasn't just negligence anymore. "Can you recover the ledger?" Miller asked, leaning over my shoulder. I looked at the cascading lines of blue text. The data was fragmented but still readable in the cache. I could see the offshore account numbers flickering on the screen. It was enough to bury them both. I reached for the save command but stopped. A high-priority alert flashed across the top of the monitor. Someone was accessing the server room from the external fire escape. The heavy steel door at the back of the room creaked open. Sarah stood there, her hair disheveled and her eyes wild. She wasn't carrying a phone this time. She held a heavy industrial fire extinguisher. Her gaze wasn't on the auditors or the terminal. She was looking at the main power coupling. She realized that if she couldn't hide the data, she could physically destroy the hardware. She swung the heavy canister toward the rack. Miller shouted for security, but the room was too loud with the sound of cooling fans. I didn't move to stop her. If she smashed the server, the purge would complete instantly. All evidence of my own proprietary work would also vanish into the smoke. She paused, the extinguisher hovering near the expensive glass. Our eyes met, and I saw a desperate woman ready to burn it all. She smiled, a terrifying and broken expression. Julian wasn't the only one hiding secrets. Sarah froze with the extinguisher raised. The heavy canister caught the red emergency light, glowing like a brandished coal. Miller took a cautious step forward, his hands raised in a useless peace offering. He was a man of ledgers, not physical violence. I stayed seated at the terminal, my fingers hovering over the escape key. The system was still groaning under the weight of Julian's botched purge. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the master power coupling. She was one swing away from total darkness. "Don't do it, Sarah," Miller urged. His voice was thin against the roar of the server fans. She didn't look at him. Her focus remained on me and the data flickering across my monitor. She knew the offshore account numbers were visible now. The truth was worse than the failure. It was evidence of systemic fraud. I didn't try to stop her. I wanted her to make the choice. If she swung, she would be destroying her last chance at a plea. The extinguisher hit the rack with a sickening crunch of glass and metal. Sparks showered Sarah's pastel blazer as the primary power coupling shattered. Half the lights in the room died instantly. The high-pitched whine of the cooling fans dropped into a low, mournful growl. Miller shouted into his radio for security. Sarah stood over the wreckage, her chest heaving as the extinguisher fell from her hands. She looked satisfied. She thought the digital ghosts were finally gone. She was wrong. I pointed at the secondary monitor on the wall. The screen was still glowing bright blue. The power had been cut to the main racks, but my proprietary scripts had redirected the flow. They were drawing energy from the uninterruptible power supply I had installed 3 years ago. The audit trail was still moving. It was migrating to an off-site server that Sarah couldn't reach. The data wasn't just surviving. It was escaping, Her face crumpled into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "It's a failsafe, Sarah," I said. My voice was calm in the darkened room. I had coded this routine after she first mentioned Julian's gambling habits at a Christmas party. I knew the day would come when they would try to burn the evidence. The migration was 80% complete. Sarah lunged for the terminal, but Miller finally caught her arm. She fought him with a feral strength. She was desperate. She was losing everything in a matter of seconds. The elevators chimed at the end of the hallway. 4 men in dark tactical gear burst into the server room. They weren't corporate security. They were federal agents with the Financial Crimes Division. They moved with a clinical efficiency, pinning Sarah against the cooling rack. Miller stepped back, smoothing his tie with trembling hands. One agent looked at the blue screen and then at me. "Is the data secure?" he asked. I nodded once. The truth was finally in safe hands. Julian appeared in the doorway, escorted by 2 agents. His face was a map of bruises and regret. He saw his wife in handcuffs and collapsed onto his knees. He started babbling about the debt and the offshore accounts. He was trying to cut a deal before the agents even read him his rights. Sarah didn't look at him. She stared at me with a cold, piercing hatred. I realized then that she hadn't just known about the skimming. She had been the one orchestrating the entire scheme. The agents began tagging the equipment for evidence. One of them handed me a business card and told me to stay in the city. My testimony was now the cornerstone of their entire case. I stood up and stretched my stiff back. The weight of the last 12 years felt like it was finally lifting. I walked past Julian, who was still huddled on the floor without a word. He reached for my trouser leg, but I stepped over him. He was a small man in a very large storm. I reached the lobby and found the building surrounded by police cruisers. The red and blue lights splashed across the glass like a chaotic painting. Journalists were already gathering near the fire lane, sensing the blood in the water. I saw the black SUV Sarah had arrived and being towed away. The empire was being dismantled piece by piece. I felt a strange sense of emptiness. The battle was over, but the silence felt heavier than the noise. It was done. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I reached the sidewalk. It was a private message from the board's chairman. He was offering me a temporary role as the acting director of technology. The salary was triple my old rate. I looked back at the darkened tower and the shattered windows of the 15th floor. I didn't even hesitate before hitting the delete button. I wasn't going back inside that building. I had a different subpoena waiting in my inbox for the morning. The federal agents led Sarah away in a blur of flashing lights. I walked 2 blocks to a nearby park bench. The night air was cool, but my hands were still buzzing. I needed to check the integrity of the off-site migration one last time. My tablet screen flickered to life in the dark. The progress bar reached 100%. The primary ledger was secure on a private cloud server. I finally held the absolute truth. Sarah and Julian were completely finished. A heavy sedan pulled up to the curb. The tinted window rolled down slowly. It was Linda, the board's chief of staff. She looked older than she did in the office. Her expression was unreadable. "The chairman wants to offer you a settlement," she said. Her voice was flat and professional. I didn't look up from my screen. "I don't want a settlement, Linda," I replied. I wanted the truth to be public. She watched me with a growing sense of dread. The offer was substantial, enough to retire comfortably. It came with a strict non-disclosure agreement. They wanted me to delete the backup scripts forever. If I signed, the federal case would lose its backbone. Sarah might walk free on a technicality. The board was terrified of the fallout. They preferred a quiet fraud over a public scandal. I felt the weight of the pen in her hand. It was a tempting escape. I looked at the flickering streetlights instead. "You're protecting a criminal," I said quietly. Linda flinched at the word. She knew the offshore accounts existed. The board had benefited from the skimming too. This wasn't just about Julian or Sarah. The entire leadership team was complicit in the theft. If I testified, the company would likely go under. Thousands of innocent employees would lose their jobs. This was the pressure they wanted me to feel. I was the one holding the sword. The choice was mine. I thought about the years of invisible work. I thought about Julian mocking my legacy. They only cared about the system when it stopped working. My value was a utility to them. I stood up and handed the unsigned folder back to Linda. Tell the chairman I'll see him in court, I said. She didn't argue. She knew I was serious. The window rolled up, and the car pulled away. I felt a strange surge of power. I was finally free. My phone buzzed with an urgent text. It was from an unknown number. "We have Julian," the message read. I froze in the middle of the sidewalk. Was this a threat or a warning? Julian had been babbling to the feds earlier. Maybe someone wanted him silent before the trial began. I looked around the dark park. A man in a gray hoodie was watching me from a distance. He didn't move. He just stood there. The tension returned instantly. I ducked into a nearby subway entrance. The station was nearly empty and smelled of damp stone. I needed a secure place to store the physical tablet. If they were willing to kidnap Julian, I was next. The federal subpoena was my only shield. I reached the platform just as a train arrived. I stepped on and moved to the middle car. The man in the hoodie was nowhere to be seen. I took a deep breath. My heart was racing. The train rattled through the dark tunnel. I checked the encrypted line again. The message had been deleted remotely. This meant the attackers had access to high-level surveillance tools. It wasn't just a corporate board anymore. Julian had likely borrowed money from the wrong people to cover his debts. Sarah's fraud was probably just the tip of the iceberg. I realized I was caught in a much larger web. The stakes had moved far beyond an office rivalry. I was in danger. I reached my destination, a small storage locker near the docks. I kept a backup of my personal files there. I slipped inside the facility and scanned my thumb. The door clicked open with a heavy mechanical thud. I placed the tablet inside a lead-lined box. This would block any remote wiping signals. I felt safer once the metal lid closed. The data was now physically isolated from the world. I just had to stay alive until morning. The facility's alarm suddenly began to blare. A strobe light blinded me for a second. The main gate was being forced open from the outside. I heard the sound of heavy boots on the metal floor. They weren't the police. I retreated into the back of the locker. My only weapon was a heavy wrench on the shelf. I gripped the cold steel tightly. Someone was calling my name in a low, distorted voice. They knew exactly where I was hiding. The wrench felt cold and heavy in my hand. I stayed low behind the metal shelving as the footsteps grew louder. The strobe lights turned the storage facility into a series of jagged, frozen frames. A shadow stretched across my locker door, followed by the metallic click of a safety being disengaged. I braced for a fight, but the voice that spoke was familiar. It was Sarah's lead auditor, Miller. He was alone and breathing hard, his silk tie finally loosened. Miller stepped into the small light of my locker. He looked frantic, clutching a thick manila envelope against his chest. I didn't lower the wrench. He told me the feds had been compromised from within. Someone in the district office was on Sarah's payroll. Julian hadn't been kidnapped by thugs. He had been taken by the very agents meant to protect him. The power balance shifted again. I was no longer an asset. I was a loose end in a dirty game. I looked at the lead-lined box holding my tablet. If Miller was telling the truth, the subpoena was a trap designed to locate the data. I realized my lie about being safe was the most dangerous thing I owned. My need for justice had blinded me to the scale of Sarah's reach. Miller handed me the envelope. It contained original contracts Julian thought he had burned. These were the paper receipts that could bypass any corrupted digital trail. I saw Sarah's real signature. We heard the heavy gate rattle again. This time, there were multiple voices and the sharp bark of a radio. Miller looked at me and pointed toward the rear ventilation shaft. He told me to take the documents and run. I grabbed the box and the envelope, slipping them into my rucksack. I didn't thank him. Trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. I climbed into the dark, narrow duct as the first flashlights hit the walls. The air in the vent was stale and tasted of rust. I crawled toward the exit, hearing the sounds of a struggle below me. Miller was shouting, distracting the men to give me a head start. I reached the exterior grate and kicked it open, tumbling onto the wet gravel of the alleyway. The city skyline looked different now. It wasn't a collection of buildings, but a network of traps. I stood up and started running toward the federal courthouse. The morning sun began to bleed over the horizon. I reached the courthouse steps and found a different group of agents waiting. They wore local police uniforms and looked professional. One of them stepped forward, holding a pair of handcuffs. He didn't ask for my name. He simply reached for my bag. I realized then that the truth had already been rewritten. The news on a nearby screen showed my face. I was being named as the primary suspect in the network crash. The narrative had shifted from whistleblower to saboteur in a single news cycle.